cold wool scraping against my windpipe. That's how I died. Now I'm staring at the exact same mustard yellow scarf, practically vibrating with static, folded neatly on my dorm bed. I didn't scream. I just picked it up, walked to the plastic trash can, and dropped it in. Cinder block walls. The faint, metallic hum of a dying mini fridge. The cloying, synthetic stench of vanilla body mist meant to mask the smell of stale laundry. I was back in room 412. My fingers flew to my throat. The skin was smooth, intact. No feeding tube. No raw, weeping lesions. No bandages crusted with the black tar-like bile I had spent my final days choking on. I dug my nails into my own flesh, pressing hard enough to leave deep, crescent-shaped indentations just above my collarbone. Pain bloomed sharp, hot, and blessedly normal. I was alive. It took 30 seconds for the disorientation to fade into something colder. I didn't fall to my knees and thank the universe. I didn't weep. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feeling the cheap polyester quilt scratching the backs of my thighs, and stared at the thing sitting on my pillow. The scarf. It was a hideous shade of mustard yellow, knitted from some cheap acrylic blend that squeaked if you rubbed it between your fingers. It looked harmless. A thoughtful, handmade gift from a roommate, trying to bridge the gap between us before the winter break. The dorm door clicked open. The hinges whined a high-pitched scrape I suddenly remembered ignoring for 3 months straight. Bethany walked in. She was carrying a paper cup of awful dining hall coffee, her pale cheeks flushed from the November wind outside. She wore her signature oversized beige cardigan, the sleeves pulled down over her knuckles to make her look smaller, softer, more fragile. Her mousy brown hair was tucked behind her ears, framing wide, watery eyes that always seemed to be pleading for a favor. "Oh, you're up!" Bethany said. Her voice was breathy, a little too high, laced with that forced cheerfulness she used whenever she was about to ask for something. She set the coffee down on her desk and turned to me, clasping her hands together. "Did you see it?" I looked at her, really looked at her. In my past life, I had thought Bethany was just needy, annoying, sure, but harmless. I had felt sorry for her. When she gave me the scarf, claiming she spent 3 weeks knitting it just for me because I always looked so cold, I had worn it out of guilt, even when it made my neck itch, even when I started losing my voice, even when the doctors told me the infection was spreading to my vocal cords. Bethany was right there by my hospital bed, crying harder than my own mother, soaking up the sympathy of everyone who visited. She had stolen my life, siphoned it through that yellow yarn, right under my nose. "I saw it," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, raspy, dry, but strong. It didn't rattle in my chest. "I know yellow isn't exactly your favorite color," Bethany rambled, taking a step closer, her eyes locked on the scarf. "But I found this vintage pattern online, and I just felt like it was meant for you. I infused it with, like, all my good intentions, just to keep you warm." Infused. The word hung in the stale air of the dorm room. I stood up. My knees trembled slightly, a residual weakness from a death I hadn't died yet. But I locked them straight. I reached out and picked up the scarf. The moment my skin touched the yarn, a sickening jolt shot up my arm. It wasn't static electricity. It felt like sticking a wet finger into a warm, humming socket. The material was slightly heavy, dense with whatever sick, parasitic binding she had woven into the stitches. "Catherine," Bethany's smile faltered. Her eyes darted from the scarf to my face. "Do you not like it?" There it was, the trap, the guilt trip. The invisible social pressure designed to make me smile, say thank you, and wrap my own death sentence around my neck so I wouldn't seem ungrateful. I held her gaze. Her pupils were dilated, eager. She was practically salivating, waiting for me to put it on so the transfer could begin. I could smell the stale coffee on her breath, mixing with the vanilla spray. Without breaking eye contact, I turned my wrist and dropped the scarf. It fell with a pathetic, muffled thud straight into the cheap plastic trash bin beside my desk, landing softly over a crumpled wrapper and discarded tissues. The silence that followed was absolute. The mini fridge stopped humming. Bethany's mouth opened, shut, and opened again. The sweet, fragile mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second. The muscles in her jaw jumped, and her eyes darkened, a flash of pure, unadulterated venom contorting her features. It was a face I had never seen before, not even when I was dying. It was the face of a predator watching its meal walk away. "What did you do?" she whispered, her breathy tone gone, replaced by something flat and hollow. "I don't like mustard yellow," I said, stepping past her to grab my coat from the back of the door. I shoved my arms into the sleeves, feeling the sturdy canvas settle over my shoulders. "And I'm allergic to acrylics. It makes my throat close up." Bethany stared at the trash can like it had offended her ancestors. Her hands, still covered by the oversized sleeves, balled into tight fists. "I spent weeks on that. I made it for you." "Then you shouldn't have," I replied, zipping my coat up. I didn't owe her anger. I didn't owe her an explanation. I owed her nothing but the cold, hard reality of my survival. "Don't dig it out, Bethany. It's trash." I walked out the door and let it slam shut behind me, the heavy bang echoing down the linoleum hallway. I made it to the stairwell before my legs gave out. I sank onto the concrete steps, pressing my forehead against the cold metal railing, and finally, quietly, took a long, deep breath of dusty, unsullied air. When I returned to the dorm 4 hours later, the room was dark. The only illumination came from the yellow street lamp outside, slicing through the gap in the blinds. Bethany was sitting on her bed, her back to me. She was perfectly still, her silhouette hunched over something in her lap. I flipped the heavy plastic light switch. The fluorescent tube on the ceiling flickered twice before buzzing to life, casting an unforgiving, pale glare over everything. Bethany didn't flinch. She just slowly turned her head. Wrapped tightly around her neck, tucked up just beneath her chin, was the mustard yellow scarf. "You threw it away," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a strange, wet quality to it, like a clogged drain. "I told you it was trash," I said, tossing my keys onto my desk. I pulled off my coat and sat down, opening my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. The initial shock of waking up had burned off, leaving behind a cold, clinical detachment. I felt like a scientist observing an experiment in a petri dish. "It's a waste to throw away a perfectly good gift," Bethany muttered. She stroked the thick yarn with her thumb. Her nails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles red and inflamed. "If you won't accept my good intentions, then I'll just have to keep them for myself. Suit yourself." I turned back to my screen, but I kept my peripheral vision locked on her. The mechanics of the curse, if you could call it that, I preferred the term parasite, were specific. I had spent months in that hospital bed, hopped up on morphine, connecting the dots when it was far too late. Bethany didn't invent the binding. She had found it in a dusty, self-published occult zine she bought at a thrift store downtown. It was a simple transference ritual. The knitted object acts as a sponge. The wearer's vitality, their luck, their literal life force gets absorbed by the material and funneled back to the creator. In my past life, as I coughed up blood and lost my hair, Bethany had flourished. Her acne cleared up. She aced exams she hadn't studied for. Liam, the guy from our biolab I had been quietly dating for 2 months, suddenly stopped visiting me and started taking Bethany out for coffee because she was just so exhausted from taking care of me. She had glowed with my stolen life. But what happens when the creator and the wearer are the same person? What happens when the sponge tries to siphon water from a dry well, only to pump it right back into the same decaying source? A closed loop. The next morning, the changes started. I woke up to the sound of hacking. It was a dry, awful sound, echoing from the bathroom down the hall. When Bethany returned to the room, she looked terrible. The bags under her eyes were bruised, a sickly shade of purple. The skin around her nose was flaky and dry, but the scarf was still wrapped securely around her neck, even though the radiator in our room was currently blasting heat like a furnace. "You okay?" I asked, pouring water from my Brita pitcher into a glass. I kept my tone perfectly neutral. Casual roommate concern. Fine, she snapped. Her voice cracked on the vowel, breaking into a harsh rasp. She cleared her throat, a wet, rattling noise that made my own stomach twist in sympathetic memory. Just a dry throat. Must be the heating in here. You should probably take the scarf off then, I said, taking a sip of water. It was cool and clean, sliding down my intact throat beautifully. You'll overheat. Her hand shot up, her fingers digging into the yellow yarn as if I had threatened to rip it off her. No, it's comforting. I put a lot of work into it. Okay, I shrugged, grabbing my backpack. The decline over the next week was exponential. In my past life, it had taken a month for the first real symptoms to hit me, but Bethany was caught in an accelerated feedback loop. The scarf was constantly draining her to feed her, achieving nothing but wearing down her physical form with the friction of the transfer. The room began to smell. It wasn't the vanilla spray anymore. It was a sour metallic odor, the smell of dying cells and stale breath. I started keeping the window cracked, ignoring her complaints about the cold. On Wednesday, Liam came knocking. I opened the door to find him leaning against the doorframe, wearing his worn denim jacket, looking mildly annoyed. Liam was handsome in a thoroughly unremarkable way. Sandy hair, decent jawline, the kind of guy who did the bare minimum in group projects but somehow charmed his way into an A. I had thought I loved him. Looking at him now, I just felt a profound, exhausting boredom. "Hey, Catherine," he said, offering a lopsided smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is Beth around? We were supposed to go over the lab report." Beth. They were already on nickname terms. She had been laying the groundwork even before the scarf was finished. "She's in here," I said, stepping aside. Bethany was sitting at her desk, wrapped in a heavy blanket, the yellow scarf prominent around her neck. When she turned to look at Liam, I saw him physically recoil. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The whites of her eyes were threaded with angry red veins, and her skin had taken on a gray, waxy pallor. "Hey, Liam," she croaked. It sounded like she was speaking through a mouthful of gravel. She tried to smile, pushing that soft, fragile girl persona, but with her decaying face, it just looked grotesque. Liam took a half step backward into the hallway. "Whoa, are you contagious? Because I really can't afford to get sick right now. Midterms are next week." Bethany's face fell. The rejection hit her harder than any physical symptom. No, it's not a cold," she rasped, standing up quickly, too quickly. She swayed, grabbing the edge of the desk to steady herself. "It's just allergies." "I swear, we can still do the report." "Yeah, maybe we should just do a Google Doc," Liam said, his eyes darting to me, seeking an ally in his quick retreat. "Feel better, Bethany. Catch you later, Catherine." He bolted. Bethany stood there, staring at the empty doorway. The silence in the room stretched tight, snapping only when she let out a sudden racking cough. She covered her mouth with her hands, doubling over. When she pulled her hands away, there was a smear of dark, tar-like blood across her knuckles. She stared at it, her eyes wide with mounting terror. She looked at me. I didn't offer a tissue. I didn't rush over to rub her back. I sat on my bed, resting my chin on my hand, and watched her. "You should really see a doctor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly clear. "That looks serious." November bled into December, and room 412 became a mausoleum. The decay was not quiet. It announced itself in the relentless wet rattle of Bethany's breathing. It clung to the cheap drapes in the form of a sour, fermented odor, like rotting fruit left at the bottom of a sealed plastic container. I stopped eating in the room entirely. I would take my meals down in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the cafeteria, chewing on dry toast and watching the snow pile up against the glass, savoring the simple, miraculous act of swallowing without pain. Bethany stopped going to classes. She stayed huddled under her thin polyester comforter, shivering violently despite the radiator cranking out dry, oppressive heat. And she never took off the scarf. It was horrifying to watch, yet impossible to look away from. The mustard yellow acrylic seemed to grow brighter, practically pulsing with a sickly vibrance, even as the girl wearing it withered into a husk. The ritual she had used was crude, a parasite that demanded a host. Because I had rejected it, the parasite turned on the only viable energy source left in its immediate orbit, its creator. But Bethany wasn't designed to be the battery. The friction of the magic, the constant, desperate pulling of energy that had nowhere to go but back into her own collapsing system was burning her out from the inside. I watched her try to take it off on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, typing out a sociology paper on the structural failures of modern community support systems. The irony wasn't lost on me. Behind me, the bed spring squeaked. A frantic scratching sound followed. I paused my typing, keeping my eyes glued to the glow of the laptop screen, but angled my head just enough to catch her reflection in the dark window pane. Bethany was clawing at her own throat. Her fingers, now bony and tipped with bruised purpled nails, dug into the thick yellow loops. She was trying to pull the scarf over her head. But the moment the fabric lifted an inch from her collarbone, a low, guttural whimpering spilled from her cracked lips. Her whole body seized, violently trembling, as if she had been plunged into freezing water. The parasite was starving, and taking it off meant cutting off the artificial drip feed of her own recycled, tainted life force. She let go, gasping for air, and shoved the scarf frantically back against her neck. The moment it settled, her shoulders slumped in exhausted relief. She fell back onto the pillows, weeping. It was a pathetic, dry sound. She didn't have the hydration left for real tears. A sharp, ugly pang of something like guilt twisted just beneath my ribs. It wasn't pity. It was the deeply human revulsion of watching an animal chew its own leg off in a trap. I could have helped her. I could have walked over, pinned her arms down, and cut that hideous yellow monstrosity off her neck with a pair of craft scissors. I knew how to stop it. But then I remembered the hospital room from my past life. I remembered the blinding, agonizing pain in my chest as my lungs filled with fluid. I remembered looking up through a haze of agony and seeing Bethany sitting by the window, her skin glowing, her hair thick and shining, texting Liam while I drowned in my own body. The guilt dissolved, leaving behind a cold, hard stone in my stomach. I hit the space bar and kept typing. The clicking of my keyboard filled the room, a steady, indifferent rhythm masking the sound of her jagged breathing. By Thursday, the resident advisor finally intervened. Sarah was a perky junior who wore lanyard necklaces and treated dorm administration like an Olympic sport. She knocked sharply before using her master key, poking her head into the gloom of our room. "Hey guys, just doing a wellness woe." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The smell hit her instantly. She pulled her sweater up over her nose, her eyes watering. "What is that smell? Is something dead in the vents?" "Bethany has a really bad flu," I said calmly, swiveling in my chair. "I've been telling her to go to the campus clinic for days, but she refuses to leave her bed." Sarah stepped tentatively into the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She looked at the lump under the covers on Bethany's bed. "Bethany?" Sarah called out, her authoritative RA voice wavering. "Honey, you need to go to the health center. This isn't... You can't just stay in here like this." The covers shifted. Bethany slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position. Sarah actually gasped, taking a physical step backward. Bethany's hair was falling out in clumps, exposing angry, red patches of scalp. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched so tightly over her cheekbones she looked skeletal. Dark, bruised hollows swallowed her eyes, which darted around the room with a feverish, feral panic. But wrapped securely, tightly around her throat was the bright, immaculate yellow scarf. "I'm fine," Bethany croaked. Her voice was barely a whisper now, ravaged by the internal decay. "Just tired. Please close the door." "You are absolutely not fine," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. Her hands were shaking. "I'm calling campus security to escort you to the medical center. This looks like severe pneumonia or malnutrition." "No!" Bethany lunged forward, a sudden burst of panicked adrenaline throwing her out of the bed. Her knees hit the linoleum with a heavy, painful crack, but she didn't seem to notice. She scrambled toward Sarah, her bony hand reaching out to grab the hem of the RA's jeans. "No doctors. They don't know. They can't fix it. Just leave me alone." Sarah shrieked, ripping her leg away from Bethany's grasp and backing out into the hallway. "I'm calling the paramedics," she yelled, slamming the door shut behind her. Bethany stayed on the floor. She didn't have the strength to stand back up. She curled into a tight fetal position, her chest heaving, her fingers automatically rising to clutch the yellow yarn at her neck. I stood up from my desk and walked over to her. I didn't crouch down. I just stood over her, looking down at the tangled mess of limbs and cheap acrylic. "They're going to take it away from you, Bethany," I said, my voice low and even. "The doctors. When they get you to the ER, the first thing they'll do is strip you down to put you in a gown. They're going to cut that scarf off." Her eyes widened, fixing on my shoes. A fresh wave of terror rippled through her. She understood perfectly. Without the scarf, the loop would break abruptly, and her hollowed-out system would simply collapse. The parasite had already consumed the foundation. Only the scaffolding of the curse was holding her upright. "Help me," she whispered. It was the first time she had directly asked me for anything since the morning I threw the scarf in the trash. "Catherine, please." I looked at her pleading eyes. I searched my own chest for a drop of mercy. A sudden urge to be the bigger person, to be the hero of this miserable little story. I found absolutely nothing. "You made your bed, Beth," I said softly. "Now lie in it." The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. They brought a stretcher, heavy boots thudding against the thin dorm carpeting. The room flooded with flashing red lights from the ambulance parked on the street below, slicing through the window blinds and painting the cinder block walls in erratic, bloody strokes. I stood by the window, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, staying entirely out of their way. "Miss, we're going to need you to lay flat," a burly paramedic instructed, snapping on blue latex gloves as he knelt beside her. Bethany thrashed weakly as they lifted her onto the portable stretcher. She was a dead weight, but her hands were locked in a death grip around the yellow scarf. "Vitals are crashing," the second paramedic said, slapping a blood pressure cuff onto her stick-thin arm. "Pulse is barely palpable. We need to get an IV in now." "Sir, she's burning up," the first paramedic noted. Feeling her forehead, he reached down toward her neck. "Let's get this thick thing off her. She's suffocating." "No!" The scream that tore from Bethany's throat didn't sound human. It was a raw, tearing sound, like rusted metal giving way. It was the loudest noise she had made in weeks. She batted weakly at the paramedic's hands, her eyes rolling wildly in her skull. She looked past the paramedics. She looked directly at me. Through the chaos, through the shouting of the medics and the static of their radios, her eyes locked onto mine. The fragile facade was entirely gone. The mask she wore for the world, the sweet, misunderstood girl who just wanted to knit a gift for her roommate, had completely burned away. What was left was the truth, ugly, malicious, and utterly defeated. In that single, fractured second of eye contact, I knew that she knew. She realized I hadn't just gotten lucky. She realized I hadn't just arbitrarily thrown the gift away. She saw the cold, unimpressed stillness in my posture, and she finally understood that I remembered everything. I remembered the bile, the failing organs, the suffocating darkness of my own stolen death. She was staring at a ghost who had refused to die. Her lips moved. I couldn't hear the words over the noise of the medical equipment, but I didn't need to. I could read the shape of them. "You knew." I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply maintained eye contact and slowly, deliberately blinked. "Hold her arms," the paramedic barked, pulling a pair of heavy trauma shears from his belt. Bethany thrashed, a final desperate surge of adrenaline, but it was useless against the weight of the two men holding her down. The heavy metal blades slid under the thick, mustard yellow yarn. With a sharp, decisive snip, the paramedic cut through the fabric. The reaction was instantaneous. Bethany didn't scream this time. Her entire body went rigidly, horrifyingly stiff. The cut ends of the scarf fell away from her throat, dropping onto the white sheets of the stretcher. The bright yellow color seemed to instantly dull, turning into the muddy, ugly shade of old mustard. A long, ragged exhale escaped Bethany's parted lips. It sounded like air being let out of a punctured tire. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. The manic, feverish energy that had kept her going completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but an empty, broken shell. "She's coding!" the medic shouted, scrambling for the defibrillator pads, starting chest compressions. The room devolved into a frantic, mechanical blur of life-saving protocols that I knew with absolute certainty would fail. There was no life left to save. The battery was entirely depleted. I turned away from the stretcher. I didn't need to watch the end. I had already lived it once. I walked over to my closet and pulled down my heavy canvas duffel bag. While the paramedics pumped the chest of the girl who had tried to murder me with acrylic yarn, I began folding my clothes, jeans, sweaters, t-shirts. I moved with slow, methodical precision. The sensory details of the room, the metallic tang of adrenaline, the heavy thud of compressions, the sharp smell of antiseptic wipes washed over me, but they didn't touch me. I was completely sealed off. "Clear!" the medic yelled. The body on the stretcher jolted. I zipped the duffel bag shut. By the time they officially called it, laying a white sheet over Bethany's face and rolling the stretcher out into the hallway, my bags were packed and sitting by the door. Sarah, the RA, was standing in the doorway, sobbing into her hands. The hallway was lined with pale, terrified college students in pajama pants, whispering frantically as the covered body was wheeled past them. "I'm so sorry, Catherine," Sarah wept, reaching out to touch my arm as I picked up my bag. "This is so traumatic. We can get you emergency housing. You shouldn't be in this room tonight." "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "I'm transferring. I won't be back next semester." Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face confused. "But right now, where are you going to go?" "Home," I said simply. I slung the heavy strap of the duffel bag over my shoulder and walked out into the hallway. I didn't look back into room 412. I didn't look at the empty bed, or the cheap plastic trash can, or the severed pieces of yellow yarn lying dead on the linoleum. I walked down the stairwell, pushed open the heavy double doors of the dormitory, and stepped out into the biting December cold. The winter air hit my lungs like a shockwave, sharp, freezing, and incredibly pure. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the cold air fill my completely healthy, undamaged chest. It hurt just a little. It was the best thing I had ever felt. Thank you so much for listening to the bitter end of this story. If this raw tale of karma and survival kept you hooked, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves dark, twisty drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have saved Bethany or let the curse run its course? Ring the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into revenge. See you in the next one.